Thank you all for being here. I can see there's a lot of interest in terror and jihad and all of that we're going to talk about now. You all know Adrian Levy, who has for close to 20 years been an investigative journalist, writing about chaotic and dangerous things like jihad, state intelligence, military, democracy, which can be dangerous a lot of times. And here we are to talk about his latest book, which takes an insider view of the hunt for Osama bin Laden in December 2011, and he really goes into the living rooms of people of Al Qaeda members and speaks to almost every key player in the Pakistan military intelligence. And this book is written like a spy thriller, and throughout it you also get this sort of insights about the Taliban, about Al Qaeda, about terror, and even state machinery that kind of breaks down a lot of the preconceived notions that we might have about these institutions. The first thing that struck me, Adrian, was that the thing that I admire most and envy most about the book is the incredible access that you got. So can you talk about the origins of the book? Was there a person or an event that happened that made you start pursuing this?
Okay, the first thing, just like a fact check here, I only do probably less than half the work, and more than half of the work's done by Kathy Scott Clark, who's not here, and we've got a kind of revolving door arrangement. And so when I leave here, I go back, and then she'll leave, and she'll go and do another piece of work somewhere else. So I'm speaking on behalf of two people with two voices, and I can just tell you that the best sections of this book were done by Kathy, and she's not here to kick my ass. I'm just telling you that that's true. And if you meet her along the line in another event, please ask her about her working methods and her patience. Although they drive me to distraction, they get great results. So it's a partnership, and that's the first thing that I really want to bring across. The second thing is, what was the instigating fact? Was there an instigating fact? Well, two things. Like all of you, I've lived through an epoch of terror, and I really feel that nearly everything that I've seen and read, with the exception of two books, first of all, is written mostly by Caucasian American men. And nearly all of it has been told through the prism of a police procedural, which is what I write in the book. It's like their spy stories, and their police stories, and their FBI stories, and their CIA stories, and some of them are very, very good. Some of them are really gripping, but somehow that doesn't help get us nearer to understanding the epoch that we're living in if we don't understand the other side. And we were in Islamabad in 2011 when the raid had happened, and ISI didn't know what to do with the wives and with the children, some of whom were injured after the Americans had raided and left them behind. And one thing led to another, and we ended up in the house with the wives and the children, and they asked us to help get them legal access, and we took a picture of the kids and the women together, some of the women, not the elder wives for reasons of respect, and that picture helped to leverage support so they could get out of the country and then move into the different lives that they have now. So that became a beginning point, access to them, and particularly to Amal, who was the fourth wife, the young Yemeni wife. And we kind of found our way, building ourselves burrowing into a bit of the domestic scene in the life of Osama bin Laden. And there's some amazing little events that took place around that, if you don't mind me.
Yes, I want you to. Yeah.
Okay. So it turned out that half the family had gone to Saudi Arabia, and they were living basically as prisoners. They had no passports. The women have no male guardians. And so they live in locked compounds where they can never go out, basically. And they live under the generosity of Bakr bin Laden, who runs the billion-dollar construction business, which was recently cleared of the Hajj crane disaster. You may remember the Mecca crane disaster. And the other half of the family, a lot of the sons, Mohammed, Omar, Laden, and a few others, they live in an extraordinary setup in Qatar. And the Qatari government gave a horseshoe of houses, and in this horseshoe of houses, where they also funded vehicles and education for the kids, there was at one stage, there was the widow of Saddam Hussein, there was her sister, there was the deputy head of Libyan intelligence, there was two relations of Gaddafi, and then there were Osama bin Laden's children. And I had this really great idea that we could make a soap opera based in the Crescent that would be like Neighbours, or maybe like Brookside, if you get that show over here. And, you know, it would be the lives of the rich and wanted living in Qatar. And we got this Google Earth picture of this perfect housing estate, and a really quite wonderful setting. There are no advertising hoardings for it like they have for the Burj Dubai or, you know, the Palms, etc. So we were really interested in the domestic engine. Like, I've got a belief that if we could get inside the domestic engine of the story, get inside the cave, if you like, then there's a chance of realizing who these people are, where they've come from, and also being able to tell more accurately where they're going, which is the final sections of the book. But we're nowhere near that stage yet, but that was my idea.
No, but you don't treat it like a sort of kitchen sink drama at all. The book gives these women and children and friends and their mother-in-laws and father-in-laws, fathers-in-law, the kind of agency, the kind of voice that you're giving equally to an ISI source or someone from the CIA. So how do you manage that, and how do you get them to talk about their experience just as you would treat any other source?
I said slightly glibly yesterday when we were talking about writing and what a hell it is writing and how difficult it can be over the years, that now a lot of stuff is enabled by smartphones. So, for example, WhatsApp has become like one of the greatest forms of research, and WhatsApp and Telegram, basically, I got really good Al-Qaeda connects by writing in Arabic in WhatsApp and Telegram. And once you actually make an approach through social media, it's really quite amazing how people respond with end-to-end decryption. At least they did when they thought that the programs were safe. Now everyone's a bit more worried about backdoors in the software. It became a long period of trust building over several years. And in fact, 2.5 years in, really we knew no more than anyone else did. And we were still thinking we may not actually go ahead with the book. We had lots of nice colour. I knew what people ate and the cars they drove, but I really didn't know much, and people didn't trust us enough. And then the Mauritanian popped up on the radar, and he's this remarkable, interesting, annoying, slightly loathsome, even though I love him, a love-hate relationship figure, who ran the religious shura of Al-Qaeda. And he vanished for many years, and no one knew where he was. And then we saw on Al Jazeera Arabic, excuse me, on Al Jazeera Arabic, we saw an interview with him, which was basically about prayer and not about jihad. And so one of the lessons we've learned, and we were talking about this yesterday, is not to censor ourselves and presume that people will say no. We never start from the vantage point that they're going to say no. We always believe that no means maybe, and that maybe means yes. So we went to Nouakchott without an introduction, and then we spent quite a lot of time in Nouakchott in Mauritania. And it turned out that this man had been with Osama bin Laden from 1995, had lived with him in Sudan. And the FBI had wanted him in connection with the 98 attacks, and, you know, he ran basically the religious committee that gave religious endorsements. And like a lot of other clerical people, he kept a diary. He kept an extraordinarily detailed diary, an account of all of his life, and he filled in one crucial missing piece. He was genuinely a man of prayer, also a scholar. His concerns were religious concerns, and the missing piece was that he had brokered an agreement for Al-Qaeda to be given refuge and sanctuary in Iran. And he did that in December 2001. And everyone, when they hear Donald Trump talking about, who's clearly mad, talking about Iran and Al-Qaeda, wondered if that was an extension of his madness. And what people ask is, why would a Sunni prescribed organization seek sanctuary in a Shia country? Well, the interesting thing is that the state is laminated in Iran, and the deep state, run by Revolutionary Guards Council and the Quds Force, are pragmatic more than they are religious, and were looking to wield pieces against the West in ways that were fitting. And it turned out that Mauritania had been before. He'd gone in 95 when they were looking to get out of Sudan, and he went and made his way over to the Gulf. And in the Gulf, he approached Saddam Hussein, who wanted no dealings with Al-Qaeda whatsoever. And Saddam Hussein shut the door. Bear this in mind for the invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein says no. But the Revolutionary Guards said yes. And they offered training to Al-Qaeda in the Bekaa Valley, where Hezbollah was training. And they were learning to make shaped charges, which were the kind of special IEDs that were then used in the Sunni Triangle to devastating effect. And the deal never came to anything, but the door was open. So the Mauritanian needed sanctuary, and he thought, press on the Iranian door. And he went in, and he went to see Haji Soleimani, the general in charge of Quds Force, sitting within the Revolutionary Guards Council. And they spent a little while deciding what to do with this Al-Qaeda offer. And just to wrap up this thing, a counterintuitive story, Iran couldn't decide what it should do because what it really wanted was to normalize relations with the West. They were sick of the calcified relations since 1979. They wanted peace, and they wanted a relationship that was progressive with the West. So they began by power brokering for the situation after Iraq in a pro-Western way. And after that, they decided to offer up Al-Qaeda if Al-Qaeda sought sanctuary. So they had a series of meetings with Ryan Crocker, who was then a senior official in the State Department, and Khalilzad, who was an emissary for the president, effectively working for the White House. And these meetings took place in 2002, and they up until April 2003. And by that stage, all of Al-Qaeda's military council, 3/4 of the family, and the religious shura were in Iran, and they were offered to America. And the answer came back from Cheney, led by the vice president: we don't want them. Because the narrative that had been presented through Colin Powell was that Iraq was sheltering Al-Qaeda, and war and the forces for war were gathering. If you remember the UN, that had already happened with a little vial, WMD plus Al-Qaeda equals war, and they didn't want to queer that narrative. The second reason was, Cheney said, every time we say no to Iran, it comes back with more. And the third reason that came from Cheney's office was, we've done Saddam, we're about to. Hard power will remove the Iranian government when we finish with Iraq. And so Al-Qaeda was left in place in Iran, and it regrouped, it refinanced, and immediately in 2003, it attacked Riyadh, the compound bombings in Riyadh, which were tremendously successful for them and killed many civilians. So the Mauritanian opened up both a world of conspiracy, a rabbit hole into an outstanding, almost incredible double life that was taking place in Iran, where the military had relocated, the military leaders, and he began to open up the domestic configuration of how the wives and children lived. That's a long answer, sorry.
No, that's a great answer. Also because it shows the kind of American, if I may use the word, idiotic decision making at that point. And another is, which you go into, which is horrifying detail also of the enhanced interrogation techniques that was employed with some of the people that they captured from the Al-Qaeda and took to secret prisons. And the other thing that I want you to talk about all of these things, because these for me were, and I think for many people were, the kind of revelations from your investigation that we didn't have before when the West, and especially America, was controlling the narrative. Another is that all of Al-Qaeda was for the 9/11, which the Mauritanian especially breaks down that notion.
Yeah, no, this is a really, really good point there. I guess I should say that another reason for writing the book was a concern generally that we didn't have access to primary sources. And like if you're a journalist and a writer, what you really want is the real sources. You want the sources written in the language, and you want them from the mouth of the person who wrote it, the pen of the person who wrote it, and you want to interview that person to make sure it's not been doctored. If you can get that chain of evidence, if that can happen, it often doesn't happen. And two things had happened. One, if you remember, Zero Dark 30 came out, and she's a great filmmaker. I really like Hurt Locker. But Zero Dark 30, it was prefaced by a statement that said, everything you're about to see is true. And it was palpably full of lies. The film said that torture worked. Torture did not work for the Americans. It's never worked. It's immoral. It's against the law. And a film that could posit that and attempt to show that crucial nuggets of information have been derived from torture was palpably wrong. And there were many other things they fudged over in this story. And then it turned out, when we spoke to Mark Bowl and other people who were doing the film, they were hosted by the CIA. And it was a projection of the White House looking for a second term for Obama, and it was not a representation of the story. And then the archives we were working in DC, they were reclassified. So the National Defense University archive of Al-Qaeda documents in Arabic, that was taken away, number one. Number two, archives and documents that was connected to a counter-radicalization scheme at West Point, they vanished. And what we had was cherry-picked documents, maybe 12 or 15 of them, and we had stories that Osama bin Laden was a weak and feeble man downloading porn, and we had Zero Dark 30. And my reaction to that triangulation was, there's got to be a way of finding a real story. That doesn't mean I empathize. I do not empathize. It does not mean that. But what it means is I don't want to be lied to. I want to understand the context in which the struggle emerged, if the struggle could have been headed off to save thousands of lives, which it could, and also what they want and what they may become, which we'll come to at the end.
So the other thing is what you find out when you go into the Al-Qaeda and when you want to see it from the other side. There is even there a sense of propaganda and also exaggeration, hope, fear, all of that together. So where do you separate that from the other truth that you're looking for?
We try to give equal platform to all the truths and then work out, it's said before, like a shattered dinner service. So you pick up the broken pieces of the plates and then you put them all together and you find out who's in the room, and then you give context to all the statements that are made. So when we went through the Mauritanian's diary, then we had to put all of that diary into context with names and dates and times and bounce it off other people, including intelligence agencies, to see if it fitted with other people's chronologies. And so it's this slow building up of information. And a lot of it's human. You know, what triggers the biggest events are human things. Like Osama had 3 wives, suddenly he decided to marry a very young Yemeni girl called Amal, who's the woman we met. And that created a personal crisis in the Majlis and in the family of Osama bin Laden, who basically accused him of having a midlife crisis for running off with this young wife. And that division within the family, which is a very real human emotion, which involves both jealousy, suspicion, and an objection to the lifestyle of someone who you've stood up on a pedestal, led to the movement dividing. A section of the movement went to Yemen, were paid to leave in disgust. And other people, including the wives, were very disgruntled and basically ostracized Amal as a result and lived separate lives while they were fleeing. So there's an example of how the human story set out by them and given equal measure helps to inform how the movement gets empowered or how it fragments. And there were many, many other instances of situations like that grew up.
Can you give an instance of when especially when you met ISI and the Pakistan military, when they are claiming things or they are positing theories, how did you actually check, verify?
Well, the most obvious one is when they claim to have made a series of high-profile arrests, or when they claim to be moving against an organization like Al-Qaeda rather than actually acting as a cloak of invisibility for Al-Qaeda. And there are several ways that we try to tease apart that very, very delicate relationship. First of all, it's hard. You know, nothing actually is written down. But what is clear are, for example, in the bin Laden sense, where he went. The fact that he had a life that was actually very open. First of all, he was in Karachi for a lot of the time, where he went on conjugal visits to see his wife. And he also went to have a social time in Karachi and meet with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's totally mad and not in Al-Qaeda. And those meetings involved a lot of other people who were living in Karachi, who provided safe houses. And so then there becomes like a larger context to interview people, to nail down dates. And actually that reminds me of something that you brought up initially. The most stunning thing that comes out of this teasing apart of fact and fiction is what is Al-Qaeda? And actually, what is 9/11? And, you know, I do not subscribe to any conspiracy theories. The Israelis didn't do it. It wasn't a controlled demolition. You know, I know, I read it on the web that these things happened. But what it was not an Al-Qaeda action. That's what we do know. We know that as a CEO of a corporation, he took it to the He took it to the Shura the Religious Shura and the Military Council, and all of them opposed it. Nearly all. There were maybe only one or two people who were placemen from Egypt. So we had a plan that was created outside Al-Qaeda by a man who didn't swear an oath to Osama bin Laden, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was a Baluchi. And the plan was hatched by people who were not in Al-Qaeda, and yet it became projected as the Al-Qaeda operation. So that's an example of, some of the most astounding things that you can learn just by actually placing people, time and place together in a period of 4 or 5 years, I guess.
Another thing that actually made me set the book down and go back and read more things is another astonishing revelation of when the US forces were on the hunt of Osama, and he was at Tora Bora in the caves, and they were afraid that he would go on to the Pakistani side, and that was when the Indian Parliament was attacked, and that was used. So, and of course, there is a strong, and we were talking about this yesterday.
There's a
popular belief among national security correspondents, and also among many people who believe in the deep state, of the Indian deep state. They believe that I think they don't subscribe to your analysis of this and feel like India was the one, or the RAW was the one that actually did the Parliament attack. And when we talked about it, you had an interesting reaction yesterday.
Yeah, I totally don't subscribe to these conspiracies. I haven't been amongst conspiracies and conspiratorialists and intelligence agencies and terror organisations and insurgents for so many years. There's much more cock-up than conspiracy. It's hard to keep a secret. It's really hard to keep a secret in Pakistan. Really, really difficult. It's hard to keep a secret in India. And I think it's actually much more straightforward what happened. And believe it or not, there's always a reason in terms of strategic defense for actions to happen. Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Toiba were working in tandem with ISI. This is not new news. I'm telling you old news. You all know that. So what was new about this was that Lashkar-e-Toiba were acting as the exit strategy for Osama bin Laden. So when Osama and the key advisors around him, who were Yemeni and Egyptian, needed to escape, they needed safe routes. And as you said, they naturally gravitated, first of all, to the cave complex in Tora Bora, for many reasons. It was safe. It also had a very specific emotional significance to Osama. We'll get to that later. But the Americans paid the Pakistan military to close the back door, and they sent troops up into the high mountains, a lot of troops. And the parting comment that was made to the head of station in Islamabad was, it'll take a war to get those guys out of the mountains. Now, if you fast forward, they're in the mountains, Osama's in the cave, and then Lashkar-e-Toiba, with an element of Jaish-e-Mohammed, attack the Indian Parliament. And that attack happens over that crucial date when Osama is playing for time in the cave. So, immediately, all of the Pakistan forces move to the Indian border, as the Indian forces move to the Pakistan border, and the back door opens out of the mountains, and Osama descends down into the valley where he's met by Nek Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Toiba, and then he's led on a circuitous journey along with other people. Some of them go to Kunar province. Now, that's a question of putting together chronology with some knowledge of Lashkar-e-Toiba and meeting with them in Meridka, but not having all the pieces. It's absolutely true, not all of the pieces. So, for example, the people who mounted the attacks, those interviews are not possible. And the arresting authorities have never wanted to talk about it. So access to raw IB has not been forthcoming. But there's still, it's one of those persistent stories, persistent conspiracy stories that the deep state configured that attack. And I find that unlikely given the power of that attack enabling Osama's escape.
I mean, thanks for clearing that up. I want to get into some of the methods, and the first thing is, of course, the absolute danger of actually reporting in some of these places and meeting some people. Every time you had a journalist in your book, and especially, we all know about Daniel Pearl, who was kidnapped and beheaded, and you have other journalists who the Al-Qaeda and members seek out to give information. And you also, just yesterday, there was a journalist who was beaten by unknown people, and there was a person, I think, just after Osama was caught in 2011, he released a book, Syed Salim Shehzad, and he was killed. So how did you navigate this? Of course, you're here to tell us the tale, but how did you navigate this to avoid not only being misused and misled, but also protecting yourself?
Okay, we don't need to talk about the danger stuff. You know, that's like another talk that someone else will give you, like the war horse talk about how dangerous it all is.
It's not about how cool it is. It's just about the practical things you did.
Okay.
Because everyone, I think it's interesting.
I think it's the ratcheting up of a plan. Make a good plan, and then make the plan better, and then work with people, the same people, for 20 years, and make that plan better and those people better with you. And then eventually, you know, your knowledge and your ability to endure increases, and your understanding of what you're seeing increases. And, you know, there are dangers in every element of what people do, but actually the biggest and most pressing challenge with something like this is boredom. You know, there's huge amounts of waiting, massive amounts of waiting when no one's paying you. And you just have to be patient, and you have to wait, and you have to think. That's the first thing. The second thing is you have to do all the mundane clerical activities that actually make an investigation work. So Kathy, who I work with, is pretty much OCD, and everything has a place. And she constructs extraordinary timelines, which are minutely detailed. And these moving timelines are actually what enable a book to happen. And then, you know, creating a hierarchy of information that you hang on the timeline. So clerical duties, patience, and, you know, mental survival when you wonder whether any new information or new breaks will happen. And also you're with people who you may not identify with, but whose stories you need to listen to. And that requires not talking. That requires being really quiet over long periods of time so that people get a chance to vocalize stuff and you get a chance to digest it and work out its place. So I think actually those skills are far more needed than, you know, the kind of Buck Rogers, Warhorse war story skills, which I slightly find annoying. The kind of pack mentality where, you know, a lot of people go with press written on a hat and zoom into a conflict. I don't see these as conflicts, and I don't see people in that pornographic way. I think you've got to actually get into the issue, slide in, and then listen to what's going on.
And since you're making this very logical and sort of, like you sat down with Excel sheets and looked at things, there's also a lot of information that kept coming in whenever the state would release documents, or you would get access to something that a lawyer would give you. So when you looked at those, I mean, managing that amount of detail, but the question in my mind was also, when do you stop and feel like now you have a sense of what happened? Yeah,
it's really difficult. We rewrote the same book, you know, 10 times because the ending kept changing. And not only that, but then we got things so wrong. And Kathy developed a very interesting relationship with another really important figure in Al-Qaeda who managed to redefine the role of the military council in Al-Qaeda. And that actually changed the way that we understood Iran yet again. And it turned out that the military council was being led by an Egyptian called Saif al-Adl, who was basically battle-hardened and had been fighting ever since the assassination of Sadat in Egypt. And he was the military brains trust of the organization, extraordinary figure. Also against 9/11, by the way, interesting. And he'd been hiding in Iran in the Quds Force base in northern Tehran. And he devised the strategy of the organization creating a lessons learned facility. They watched the US Marines, and they watched what US Marines did after conflict and realized they had to be more organic. So when they saw the bloodshed going on with Zarqawi in Iraq, and they saw the way in which they alienated the Muslim community by the butchery and the sectarian killings, they decided to revise Al-Qaeda, tone down the killings, and even they suggested changing its name, coming up with a new brand. The old name was done for them. So lessening the violence and attaching themselves to a national liberation struggle in Syria became one of their strategies. And so what they did was keep the military council in Iran, where it couldn't be attacked by drones, and they moved the rest of the organization, who were hardened fighters, into the conflict in Syria, and they became what is now known as HTS, or part of HTS now. But that information only came after we'd submitted the book. And so then we had to call it back and rewrite those sections. And then you face punitive fines from the publisher, who are just pulling their hair out saying, why don't you stop? An end is an end. And I guess the real answer then is you hope to bring another edition out. You know, like the book produces more truths, or people correct facts in the book that are wrong, relationships that may not be accurate, and then we'll have to do it again.
So you're almost watching your back the whole time, even now, yeah.
Right.
That someone's going to come up with something else.
Every day.
Yeah. So the other thing is that this book, The Exile, is probably going to be made into a Bollywood movie by Vishal Bharadwaj.
Not Bollywood.
No, not Bollywood. We won't call that. Okay, it's an international film. Vishal Bharadwaj, the director who also made Maqbool and Haider. So he's very. And I read some interviews where he talks about who might be the protagonist, because one of the things is he finds that Osama bin Laden is too larger than life a character, so he wants to use a guard. So I want to ask you, when you write about a larger than life characters, and before this, your books, The Meadow, have written about victims and their families. The other books look into the state establishment. When you look at someone like this, who has a story around him, who's so larger than life, what goes on in your mind? Is there a different approach to it?
I think you've got to take a refracted approach and tell an individual's story through their relationships with other people as well as what they write. Because the way they're perceived by other people is very often a very interesting way of understanding the psychology. And one thing to say here is none of this is about defending the indefensible. You know, like people will ask, why would you bother? You know, bad things were done and thousands of people have died, and why would you bother? But if you look at, we'll get to the answer now, but if you look at the Third Reich, if you look at the Russian Revolution, if you look at the great events in history that have happened, enormously important books are coming from Germany and Russian, written in German and Russian, which are providing psychology around those characters. The film Downfall that came out of Germany, set in the bunker, you know, it's important to be able to understand the relationships and the figures that come out of this epoch in order that we can understand the epoch and how we relate to it. So, how do we build up a composite picture? By refracted knowledge. The more people, the wives, the children, how did the sons see him? Was he an abusive father? It turns out he was. How did the wives perceive him? Some lovingly, others not. One certainly ran. And how did his life begin? He began as a boy racer, an elegant boy in the hood, driving a gold Mercedes and crashing around town, being a bit of a ladies' man. And actually that evolution from there into an ascetic, a man who sculpted his beard to look like the Mahdi, who appeared in a cave setting so that he looked more holy, and who really, really carefully placed himself in his environment, that becomes as relevant. You have a messianic figure, a figure who's also an ego, self-delusional, and a father, and it's a much more complete picture.
I've been asked to wind up, so I have a last question before we allow the audience to ask questions, and that is a combination of two things. One, what brings you again and again to this subject of jihad and terror, and the other is and you were saying something of this yesterday, and I was thinking about it last night, about some of your own notions and certainties that have been shattered over these years, and repeatedly you revisit them and you think about it. So a combination of this, what takes you back, and what certainties have become undone?
I think we're living in times of chaos where we need more understanding. I need that myself, so it's a personal quest for more understanding. I also have become increasingly untrusting of a lot of the media that's in the mass domain. It's either vested or paid for news, and it's full of errors. Simple facts, including people's relationships, are spun as truths and then repeated time and time and time again through the echo chamber of the internet, and they're palpably wrong. The government also controls narratives very successfully nowadays, and it's less easy for us to find primary sources. And so I think the onus is on us, it comes back to us, to find ways of doing this free of vested interests in ways that give balance to very important stories that we're living in now. We're in a tinderbox. India-Pakistan can be a tinderbox. The Jihad Factory, it's a tinderbox. Understanding precisely how that works, more precisely, knowing there are Talibans, not Taliban, knowing the difference between the modules in southern Punjab, etc. It may not make for a great read, but in my own head, it's part of my education as to how these movements come about. And let's avoid exaggeration. Let's avoid that. Let's avoid the vested interests in that sense and try and get to a nub of where we're going. That's what's driven both Kathy and I, being sick of being lied to, I guess.
Thank you so much. And in the kind of book it is actually great for this moment, because so many misconceptions and prejudices about communities that move to violence, especially across the border in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So thank you so much. So we'll take questions, and I'm just going to, if you can stand up, then I'll be able to see you. Yes. Minal, first question.
It'll be a tough one.
No, not really. I have two questions actually. One is about, you have a very, very good and close understanding of the Pakistani security establishment and the deep state. Do you think what happened to Nawaz Sharif following the revelations in the Panama Papers, does the Pakistani deep state have any sort of hand in eventually what happened to him?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is like haiku, so all of this is like reading small, tiny signs and then tipping the teacup upside down at the same time. But all the indicators are exactly that. If you look at the forensic evidence that was done amazingly quickly with the inquiry that had two brigadiers that sat on board, they called it an SIT. On that SIT, they reached a very specific point in the Panama Papers where they identified a period of financial growth, and only a state could have identified that point so quickly using a very advanced system of analysis. They then matched that to a document forged by Mariam, where we had Fontgate, and the Fontgate phenomena can also really only have been done by a sophisticated intelligence agency that knew which document out of 9,500,000 was the right one to look at and examine the font. So if I look at it that way, it seems to me that either Kroll or the ISI was involved more than likely in the advancing of that truth. And maybe the more important question then is, what does it serve them?
Yes. What do you think is in there? Like, I mean, they're not interested in Musharraf, they're not interested in Nawaz Sharif. What do you think that, what's the ultimate goal?
They want a puppet in government and they want Imran Khan.
So I'm sorry, apparently we're out of time and there's no more questions that you can ask on the mic, but Adrian's around, so mob him. Buy his book.
So sorry to talk
I haven't
so long.
kept it here like this because to intimidate anyone, it's a big book, but it's fascinating and you'll just, kind of breeze through it. All right, so thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.